The story begins with a team of NASA astronauts on Mars busy with their mission. They're collecting soil samples when they get an urgent message. A massive storm is approaching. They're forced to abandon the mission and rush back to their spacecraft. As they make their way back, one of the astronauts, Mark Watney, gets separated in the chaos of the storm. Despite their commander's efforts to locate him, they lose all contact with Mark and can't find any trace of him. Believing he didn't survive, the crew reluctantly boards their craft and leaves Mars. However, as the storm settles, we see that Mark Watney is actually still alive. He's injured. One of the rods from his equipment has pierced his stomach, causing him a lot of pain. Somehow he manages to get up and make his way back to the shelter they'd set up on Mars. Once inside, he painfully removes the rod from his body. Mark soon realizes he's completely alone, with no way to contact NASA. The storm destroyed all the communication equipment. And the worst part was, his fellow crew members think he's gone, and the next scheduled mission to Mars won't arrive for another 4 years. To survive, Mark would need to hold out until then, but he doesn't have enough food to last that long. So he decides to take matters into his own hands. He's going to try farming on Mars. He finds some potatoes and figures he'll grow them to sustain himself. But he quickly realizes he'll need water to make the soil fertile. And Mars doesn't exactly have a water supply. Thankfully, Mark knows how to create water using hydrogen and oxygen. By mixing them and igniting the combination, he can produce water droplets. The first time he tries, though, he gets a huge explosion. He hadn't accounted for the extra oxygen from his breath. Adjusting his calculations, he tries again. And this time it works. Tiny droplets of water start to form, and Mark begins his makeshift farm on Mars. Mark carefully follows his plan, producing just enough water to keep his soil fertile. After a few days, the first plant sprouts, and he's thrilled to see a bit of life growing on Mars. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the news has spread that Watney is presumed dead, and NASA even holds a funeral for him. But the very next day, one of the satellite operators monitoring Mars notices something strange. Some equipment appears to have been moved. She quickly informs her supervisors, and they realize Mark might still be alive. However, their excitement is dampened by a harsh reality. Even if they prepare a rescue, it would take many months to reach him, and there's a serious risk he could starve before then. NASA calculates that he's already been on Mars for around 70 days, and they know the next planned mission won't arrive for another 4 years, and it'll be landing about 3,000 kilometers from his current location. If Mark wants to survive, he'll need to make the trek to that landing site, which could take him 50 days, traveling a maximum of 35 kilometers per day due to the need to recharge his rover's solar panels. Back on Earth, NASA begins working on a plan to send supplies, but it'll take 3 months to get everything ready, and the journey itself will take about 9 months. It means that'll take 1 year. In the meantime, Mark has been growing potatoes on Mars for 48 days and now has around 400 plants, more than he expected. He's even started harvesting both large and small potatoes. To fertilize his crops, he's been using his own waste, but he knows that no matter how many potatoes he harvests, he won't survive without contacting NASA. Desperate, Mark remembers an old piece of equipment left on Mars back in 1997, a Pathfinder probe that lost contact years ago. He decides to go find it, hoping it might still be able to communicate with Earth. NASA, watching his movements via satellite, realizes he's heading toward the Pathfinder's location. The system is outdated and can only send back photos, but it's a lifeline. When Mark reaches it, he sets up 3 boards in front of its camera, hoping to re-establish some form of contact. Mark sets up 3 boards in front of the Pathfinder camera. The middle board reads, "Are you getting my signal?" The left board says, "Yes," and the right one says, "No." NASA then shifts the Pathfinder camera to point at yes, confirming they're receiving his message. Realizing NASA is watching, Mark is overjoyed. From there, he and NASA begin communicating using coded messages, and NASA finally has a way to talk to him. Through these messages, Mark learns that NASA hasn't told his former crew he's alive yet. His team is still en route back to Earth, unaware he survived. NASA eventually breaks the news to them, bringing a mix of happiness and regret. They're thrilled he's alive, but saddened they had to leave him behind, knowing they can't do anything to help right now. Just as things seem to be looking up, disaster strikes. An explosion occurs in the area where Mark had been growing his potatoes, destroying his entire crop. With the controlled environment he created now ruined, there's no way to replant. NASA calculates that even with his remaining food, he won't last long enough for help to arrive, so they instruct him to ration. Mark, who'd been eating 3 meals a day, now has to stretch that out to 1 meal every 3 days. Back on Earth, NASA prepares an emergency launch to send him food and supplies, but they're racing against the clock. Skipping some safety tests to save time, they launch the rocket. But disaster strikes again. The rocket explodes shortly after liftoff, dashing all hopes for a quick resupply. When Mark hears about the failed launch, he's devastated. In a message to NASA, he says, "Please pass this on to my parents. I won't give up, but we need to be prepared for every outcome. Tell them I love my work and I'm good at it. If I don't make it, there's a purpose behind my death that's bigger than me. Let them know I'm not afraid. I've faced every challenge thrown at me." Just when all hope seems lost, China steps in to help. They have a rocket ready for space travel, and in 28 days, NASA and China prepare to work together for a new plan to save Mark. Now there's a young guy named Rich who works at Astrodynamics. He comes up with a plan to save Watney and tells NASA about it. Rich suggests that instead of having the spaceship carrying the other crew members return to Earth, they let it orbit around Earth. When it's nearby, NASA could send supplies up to the spacecraft, then use a gravity assist, a slingshot, to propel it back towards Mars. This maneuver, called a gravitational slingshot, uses a planet's gravity to redirect a spacecraft. According to Rich's plan, the crew would reach Mars without landing, as landing would use up all their fuel and leave them stranded. Instead, they'd pick Watney up using a small ascent vehicle already on Mars. Watney would launch himself into Mars's orbit, where the crew could catch him. NASA, however, hesitates. They don't want to put 5 astronauts' lives at risk to save one, especially with such a low chance of success. Rich's plan would extend the crew's mission by 533 days, and NASA ultimately decides it's just too dangerous. They're unwilling to take the risk of endangering the crew for what seems like a slim chance. Meanwhile, on Mars, Watney keeps working on the tasks he originally came to complete, preparing for the incoming storm. Rich, still determined to save Watney, manages to relay his plan to the crew. They decide to go for it, defying NASA's orders and redirecting their spaceship back toward Mars. When NASA realizes what the crew has done, they quickly get on board, sending them the supplies they'll need for the journey. China also steps in to assist with the mission. Meanwhile, Watney begins a long 90-day journey across Mars to reach the ascent vehicle. Once he arrives, he realizes he needs to shed as much weight as possible, over 5,000 kilograms, so the vehicle can reach orbit. He removes nearly every part, leaving only the bare essentials. Watney is essentially launching himself into space on an exposed, stripped-down rocket. Finally, Watney takes off, and the world watches anxiously as his ascent vehicle climbs toward the spaceship. As he enters space, he loses consciousness from the pressure, but eventually wakes up to everyone's relief. However, there's one more problem. Watney's speed is too high, making it extremely difficult to catch him. To slow down, the crew sets off a small explosion to lower their speed and then spot Watney approaching. The commander, strapped to a tether, goes out on a flying chair to try to catch Watney. But just as she's about to grab him, her tether loosens, and it looks like she won't make it in time. Thinking fast, Watney decides to puncture his spacesuit, using the air escaping to propel himself toward her. Despite the danger, he manages to reach her, grabbing onto the tether just in time. The crew pulls him aboard, and after all the near misses, Watney's life is saved. When Watney finally returns to Earth, he becomes an instructor for future astronauts, teaching them survival skills for missions to other planets. And that's where this incredible story ends. If you like the video, then you know what to do. And also share your valuable opinion about a movie down below. And lastly, subscribe also for more videos.